Good evening, everyone. Tonight's meeting is a council workshop at 6:30, and we have two items on the agenda. And the first one, we have LD 2003, and then we are doing the council goal setting. So first up, we have Emily Cole Prescott.
Hi, everyone. So what fits in comp plan goals? So Councilor, thank you. So this is a promising start to the presentation.
There you go. Do you need some assistance? Do we have someone in the back or?
No, it's just frozen.
Maybe Emily?
Okay.
Just give Nate a hammer. He can pound on it.
It's our computer.
Okay, are we ready? I can tell you I'm ready now, I think.
Yeah.
So whenever we look at policies, we try to look at the local and national context. And when we look at Saco, we have a history of various housing types. In 2021, we did a lot of work on our ordinance revisions, which allow for housing variety to continue throughout the city, which is great. We updated the comp plan, and that well aligns with the state goals. And in many ways, Saco is well positioned to make sure that we're complying with LD 2003 and to welcome a variety of people and provide a lot of housing options. The main context, many of you heard, I know there was a November 2022 workshop with fellow planning board members, so thank you, Alyssa and Matt, for joining us today, where we talked about what's going on in Maine 2003, which is going to encourage more affordable housing options. It's going to require communities to allow 2.5 times the density for affordable housing projects. It's going to require additional accessory dwelling units throughout the city. It will require up to 4 dwelling units in growth areas throughout the city. And then we will have a rule process going on for LD 2003, which is implementation is underway. So there'll be a public hearing from the DECD's office on March 1st to go over the rulemaking process. So there's going to be more to follow on the state level, as I know many of you have received some emails about rulemaking and then potentially funding. It would be a low dollar. I think Saco could probably be well equipped with the staff we have to not have to tap into funding. An opportunity that could be there. And then nationally, just so we have the context of what's going on federally, we do have missing middle all throughout the country. We talked a lot about that during the plan update and the long range planning committee with our, and then the federal government have a housing supply action plan. and there'll be higher scores for communities that have future grant funding that will be targeted toward locations that offer affordable housing. So Saco will be better equipped in the future for grant funding if we actually comply with LD 2003 and offer more affordable housing. Our comp plan goals recap. A lot of our goals are interrelated. Resiliency and sustainability is critical throughout the comp plan, and we also rely on that regional coordination piece. So there'll be regional coordination, there'll be opportunity to maintain resiliency and sustainability throughout the the ordinances we currently have on the books, and a lot of things you'll see are going to be interrelated with how we can update our ordinance standards. Some comp plan housing. Housing to meet resident budget and needs was a comp plan goal. Greater density housing in areas with sewer and water was a comp plan goal. Development near walkable locations and also bikeability, and we've been hearing a lot about that from our Bike Ed Advisory Committee. And then improving the existing housing stock. Overall, our comp plan called for a variety of housing options to retain and welcome people of all ages, incomes, lifestyles, and backgrounds as members of our community. We also want to look at what residents have told us. Residents have said that in our comp plan that we want to refurbish and renovate existing housing. We want to add units where supportive infrastructure exists, such as in the downtown or areas that have public sewer and water. We want to add second-story units to downtown historic buildings and remove the barriers to conversions, discourage subdivision, and we want to look to our design standards and make sure that what we're approving is what our citizens and residents want, and then what our future citizens and residents would like to live in. And then, of course, we've been hearing about traffic, which we've all experienced. LD 2003 looks to Saco's growth areas and specifically to growth locations in the comp plan. Most of our comp plan calls out all of the city for growth. There's specific growth areas and then limited growth areas. What I'm going to be looking at is the growth areas here. So those are the areas that I believe LD 2003 will apply. We okay over there? All right, good. So as we can see, there's a lot of shared state and local housing goals between LD 2003 as well as the comp plan, which are to prioritize density in growth areas with sewer and water, encouraging housing variety that is affordable, and conserving natural resources. It's important to note that LD 2003 does not limit the city's ability to still conserve and protect natural resources. A lot of the permitting processes that we have at least at the planning department level and the planning board level will still be applicable. So how do we comply with the new law? I took a lot of deep dive into some sections of our ordinance relative to what we have so far in LD 2003, and this is really just meant to be a high-level overview. But we will need to make revisions to the following, which are accessory dwelling units. So Saco has done a good job already complying with a lot of where the state is headed. We will allow, right now we allow accessory dwelling units in most areas of the city, and the 2021 ordinance revision we have allowed those units to be detached as well as attached. So one of the revisions we'll need to make to comply with the law is to specify that accessory dwelling units have to be at least 190 square feet in size. We can still keep our maximum size of 800 square feet that we have now. Additionally, we will need to update ADU provisions to ensure that ADUs are allowed everywhere housing is allowed, and every single family residence has the option of adding one ADU. Most of our zones already allow this, so it's not going to be a far stretch. We'll have to look at density bonuses for affordable housing in growth areas. The law 5 times the density of the area. Right now, Saco already has an elderly starting path and expand it and make it applicable to affordable housing projects. As far as affordable housing, we'll need to incorporate definition of affordable housing into the local ordinance. And then we'll need to incorporate provisions into monitoring compliance with affordable housing standards, making sure that restrictions put on affordable housing are kept in place for at least 30 years as the law requires. We'll also need to look at parking, so we'll need to make sure that we're not requiring more parking spaces for accessory dwelling units. We can only require the number of parking spaces for single families. Right now, we have a lot of maximum parking requirements that wind up with coverage and development we really need. We'll have to take a look at single-family residential zoning and make sure that additional units, dwelling units are allowed wherever single-family homes are allowed. We'll need to review our permitted and conditional uses relative to housing to make sure that we are allowing number of units on single-family residential lots by right and not by conditional use. I'm recommending that we revise our master plan development concept into a mixed-use development concept and make clear information for everyone so that it can be used moving forward to help with affordable housing projects. And then overall, the intent of the law and any compliance with it is that we do not make standards or ordinance housing that LD 2003 allows. And then when we make these ordinance revisions, let's look at what our community has told us. Let's not just focus on compliance with a law for compliance with a law. Let's take a look at buffering standards where we can, where uses mix. Let's work with city departments to gather data on development impacts and report out through a growth monitoring system so that council can look to the future when it's making budget decisions. Let's try to reduce our barriers to upper-level historic downtown conversions, which has been a long time item on the list. I'm recommending that we complete a traffic infrastructure study and figure out how we can best mitigate traffic moving forward. One aspect of this is looking at a traffic impact fee like Scarborough has. Reviewing existing ordinance options, such as the elderly density bonus, and applying it to affordable, like we just talked about, and then basically assessing the level of needed and reporting back to council. We don't know right away how much compliance is needed because we won't know how many affordable housing units are coming online right away. Examples from LD 2003 guidance. Some of this you probably saw in the guidance document that I put in the memo. Basically, the top picture shows you what is not permitted. So you can allow a single-family home, an ADU, but you cannot allow one more parking space just for the ADU. So those 3 units have to have just the required parking can only be up to what the single-family allows or requires per our ordinance. So that's one example of a somewhat minor parking ordinance change that we would need to make. And then the example to the right shows that an empty lot can have up to 4 dwelling units if it's shown in both area. So we saw this earlier from the comp plan map, and also has ability. There's other pictures in the guidance document, and that's interim guidance, so we'll know more once rulemaking comes out. So some considerations for Saco as we move forward is greater compliance monitoring will be needed. Make sure that we're going to have to start checking to make sure that sales happen once affordable housing projects go online. The deeds have the right restrictions and covenants so that they're sold to people who are eligible for the affordable status. Probably planning department will be the one to undertake this because we're already checking some of the items for other policies and paperwork and conditions of approval that we're reviewing as part of the process. It's important to note that neighboring communities will be providing their own ordinance revisions to be similar, so we might not get an influx of housing. Scarborough and Biddeford do similar things, and Biddeford's already doing a lot with affordable housing. ADUs will most likely become more popular options. I would definitely say that that will hold true. I think, Alyssa, I see your head nodding over here. We're going to need to have some education for all land use development staff to understand the state law, ordinance implementation, and any new revisions to our ordinances that come forward. We want to make sure we're all on one page as staff, which we're pretty collaborative, so I don't think that'll be too much of a heavy lift, but it's just something to consider. The path forward, education and information, like this presentation today, I hope it was helpful. Ordinance revisions, make sure that we're in compliance, and then do we want to look at affordable housing incentives? And then some next steps, we have the city administrator creating the Affordable Housing Committee for ordinance revisions. We can start relatively soon. We have money set aside from ARPA funds for a housing action plan, and then I'm recommending a traffic infrastructure study citywide to look at the traffic impacts and how those can be mitigated. So any questions, and thank you for listening, and thanks for dealing with the technology delay.
Open discussion, so anybody, you don't have to be called on, just feel free to throw out your questions.
Yeah, I guess I have a few questions. So I recognize very strongly the need for more affordable housing. I'm actually in favor of this ordinance and bill. I think it'll have positive effects on Maine, help bring in the workers we need. It's going to do a lot of good. But I worry, too, about some of the short-term consequences. And you already spoke a lot about traffic. I know also handled. Also was a little unclear on the link between affordable housing and these accessory dwelling units, and whether affordable housing somehow intersects with that, or whether the affordable housing benefits were just to new construction on lots that currently have 0 dwelling units. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of those things.
Should I respond? Are we doing a back and forth? Or okay. So as far as the link to affordable housing and ADUs are going to be allowed throughout the city. The link is really, I think the reason why they're in the law is because ADUs have traditionally been seen as a way to foster affordable spaces, because a lot of the times you might have families creating smaller spaces for there's difference in living situations, and they can move from one unit to the other. So they've been considered a way, traditionally through land use development, to spur living in one area and aging in place. As far as the rate of building, I think it's a good question. One thing that restrictions on what communities could and could not do, we'll still have the full site plan review and some coordination of policies going forward, where we might be able to implement some better smart growth opportunities. And then as far as traffic, we really have not answered a lot of some of the questions that remain on our traffic impact and sidewalk impact fees, and that's why I'm recommending that we really dive into that and work with a traffic engineering consultant who specializes in this work, so we can actually get a formula for traffic impacts and get some impact fees that are citywide, that have a nexus of understanding of why we're charging them.
Thank you.
You talked about reducing the barriers for the historic downtown district. Is there a plan, or possibly a plan going forward, that the city would be working with HPC? Because they basically are the barrier with, we're involving HPC with that to make sure what the policies are in place for people coming in and kind of making it easier. If you did have somebody wanting to come in and renovate the areas or add onto it. So that would be my suggestion for that.
I think that's a good suggestion. I mean, the other thing that maybe I didn't clarify completely in here was we have a lot of standards that prohibit the ability of converting interior floor space to multifamilies. So maybe looking at those barriers as well, so not just barriers.
I was curious about, pardon me, the city administrators, where and what composition. Can you give us a little more specifics about how that plays into this?
Yeah, so like I announced about a month ago in my report, about 6 weeks ago maybe, this is going to be a staff level committee to look at proposals out there, to vet recommendations to the council, or planning board and council, of what we could do, what's feasible, what might make sense for Saco. And so really just their initial vetting of proposals and recommendations for them to council and
So you had presented some recommendations. Which ones are a must that need to be completed before the law goes into the effect, and which ones can be completed over time to best protect the city and its growth, in any capacity that you can think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. For accessory dwelling units, we definitely need to look at those right away to make sure we're in compliance. I think that's actually going to be the most requested initially. We definitely would need to adopt the affordable housing definition from the state law, as well as adopting the density requirements. We would need to do parking, and then some of these other provisions, like we could not put conditional uses on multifamilies, but we could certainly still review multifamilies under site plan if the site required us to do that, and usually that is 10,000 square feet of. I would say at least the first few. It's not a requirement to update master plan development mixed-use concepts for compliance with the law. It's just a recommendation that we should look.
I mean, that's a lot of work to do for both. Again, I don't know what would have to go to planning first before it comes to us, but 4 months in our world, especially when you have the joint planning city council, that is a short period of time. So.
It is, and we're also still waiting for final rulemaking from the state. So it's very possible that, yes, there will be a July 1 implementation date, but really a lot of communities are going to be in the same situation we are, where compliance will be, I think, over time.
Kind of seems to me that, I mean, anything that's in the pipeline now really isn't going to be affected by this. It would seem to me that if a developer wants to build affordable housing, I mean, it's going to have to be presented that way through, say a developer right now, I'm looking at the this one section here where it says, a developer would be eligible to build 6 units, but with the new rules, he'd be eligible to build, like I said, I'm just saying, it seems to me that this isn't a deluge of
Most everything will still go through a planning board process. There will be units that are built where single-family housing is allowed now that do not need to go through a planning board process. So you might see additional units where you might have seen a conditional use review or something, acting 10,000 square feet anyway. And a developer could technically have affordable housing project right now, propose it as housing, just not want a density bonus, bring provisions of the law.
It seems to me, just responding to Councilor Purdy, that the 2 areas that might impact us most quickly is the ability to build additional units on empty lots, where now we would expect 1 unit, we could have up to 4, if I understand it, if nothing's been built, requiring no additional approval by the city, and so, right, or up to 2 that can be attached to any existing unit, could also be a fairly rapid growth in some areas. I think my ward is particularly concerned about this, right?
So the ADUs would go through building. I'll share with you, Councilor Byrne. Our ward has the ability to have ADUs just like this as it is now. So I could put up an ADU at my house tomorrow as long as I got a building permit. So really some of this is already allowed, and I'd be happy to kind of do a comparison document for wards if it would be helpful to councilors to talk with people about, like.
Actually thinking, I mean, I've gone through this myself and, tried to apply it to each zone. And again, not comprehensively by any stretch of the imagination, but I mean, I came up with largely it's LDR and the MDR that currently under this would now be allowing multifamily. There are going to be people out there that are going to wake up one day very surprised from just going through the zoning map and or parcel lots and figuring out how many units I could put on there now. So I would, agree with Councilor Berman as far as much information we can get out. I do envision some upset stomachs. Additionally, and I don't know how much this comes into play or it's up over the last 5 years, the short-term rental ordinance needs to be in place. Because there are areas you might think that wouldn't be, but all you have to do is go on Airbnb or any of those other sites, and you'll see that it's happening now, and there's entire subdivisions that has single-family homes that you'd be shocked at what they're renting those out for. And the intent of this law is to increase affordable housing or housing in general. I think, accessory units or additional units and having them utilize a short term kind of defeats that purpose. So we should be considering that at the same time we're making these changes. So I would advocate for that. Thank you.
Well, along that line, too, if we see an increase in ADUs, and you're building an ADU for your elderly parent, they pass or go to a nursing home, now you have this ADU, what do you do with it? That comes into play with getting the short-term rental ordinances in place, because you're going to, if they have an influx and all of a sudden we have all these people, hey, we got empty ADUs, what do we do with them? They're going to want to rent them out.
Yeah, and I think long ago, 20 years ago, in the last 5 to 10 years, those ADUs are throughout Saco, and they certainly don't have family members in them. They've just become apartments. And again, depending on how this, is consequences of those. I mean, as I said, from my perspective, this has little impact to my ward. It already allows, units in excess of 8, but I can certainly look around at fellow councilors' wards. Some pretty significant impact. Not just to neighborhoods, but infrastructure. So I think we need to be cognizant of that.
So Councilor Johnson brings up a good point, because, again, if you make an ADU and it's not for your family, that doesn't bother me. If you're renting it, it creates more units available for people to rent. So in the end, that still helps with housing affordability. I'm concerned on the ones that where the ADU is specifically, and I didn't think of this, ADU is specifically created for Airbnb. If you have a nice view, you have a nice scenery, you have something marketable related to a view, and the true intent of this ADU is not to make an apartment or or for your parents, so, correct?
No, we don't ask for a purpose, and we probably couldn't under law, but there are ways that you can regulate short-term rentals. That's really falls more to the code enforcement department, so I will pass this along, have a conversation with Dave Toomey, and then we can follow up through the city administrator.
Yeah, and that's where I was getting at with it. It's happening now. I know several people in the downtown area that were forced out of what was an apartment and is now an AD or a Airbnb unit. Because they, again, economically, the property owner can make far more than renting it, monthly. And it's happening. It's been happening for, like I said, 5 years ago was the first time I heard of it, and I went to codes with it, and it was, I've heard this story. It was, well, let's wait and see approach, and I waited 5 years. So this is definitely something that I'm concerned with, and that's what I would see really largely happening. You're going to see people say, I'll add that ADU and I'll get $150 a night. We think, oh, it's down by the ocean. It's not. It's right in the downtown. I have found them out in the conservation zone. Doesn't really matter at this point. So it's definitely something we need to keep our eye on.
I suppose the practical thing would be, like you said, for code enforcement, require that any ADU, if it's going to be rented out, has at least a year lease or something, though, because I foresee a situation where if you build an ADU for an elderly relative and they pass, all of a sudden you're sitting there with a potential revenue source that's just going to seed. Now, obviously, we don't want people just coming through back and forth, especially if we have a housing situation and that someone can live there. So by requiring at least a year lease, though, you're at least requiring somebody out there to actually have a place to live for a year if they want to continue living there, as opposed to it becoming a vacational sort of a thing, though. I think that would be a practical way to approach it, because obviously I don't want to hamstrung anybody who wants to rent it out, but at the same time, you know, they still want to make use of it though, but obviously don't want it to become a de facto sort of, somebody, and they're only going to stay for 9 months, well, we know how a rent is, okay, then you have to pay the rest of the penalty or something. So at least to make it practical, you know, for the person who actually owns the structure.
I believe our ordinance does have a provision about not having a short-term rental for ADUs, but I can certainly check into it and respond.
I was just going to respond to that, just to say that and decreases the amount of available housing. Us in compliance with this to really put some regulations on short-term rental uses. Not that they should be prohibited citywide, but we should think about how we do it, where we do it, how much we do it, to license them, regulate them.
Oh, go ahead, Phil. Long-term plan for affordable housing in the places that Downs is doing though, like a new community in walkable distance, have it compact and have it make sense. Us to actually tackle what we can in terms of inviting Biddeford housing, Vesta. At the end of the day, I want people to have a place to live, and I am sympathetic to a point when it comes to folks and being concerned about ADUs, though. But if we can get just on that map, though, having it on the Route 1 corridor when you're on the bus road going forward, like I said, it would alleviate concerns of ADUs all of a sudden showing up in compacted residential areas and impacting those, though, because we obviously know anybody who ever tries to get a contract zone in those areas invariably meet neighbors that complain about traffic and whatnot, and of course they don't stand on now with this law, so we might as well approach this proactively, and it's going to...
Comments for you, if I could. First of all, I want to go on record in support of some of my fellow councilors' comments. I think we're going to grow. I just want to make sure that we grow in a way that we don't become too burdensome to our infrastructure and pace it as best we can. So that's important to me. It's interesting, the ADU discussion, that zoning ordinance, and it's not a bad, I think we can probably come up with some sensible rules, but my greater concern is monitoring and compliance, and, you know, we can figure out what department that's going to, how do you keep an eye on things, and are we going to require licenses? You know, I don't know what the answer is, but it can get pretty complicated, but we can't be not moving forward because of the complications. So the compliance is a very valuable tool that we need, particularly if our goal is to try to figure out a fair and reasonable impact fee. So I'm very about the school impact. And you and I have had this conversation. I think there's no doubt that hopefully it will, because we want a community that has families and children. So I don't denying that statistically the average household is shrinking. All right, so that contributes to the decline. But when you start adding more number of children, but we're going to have more households. So I think that we need to keep that sort of on the radar screen. And the recent version of LD 2003, thanks for sharing that with me. I've always wondered about the in terms of ADUs and all that stuff, and I seem to have read in the latest and greatest version that there was some indication that they do, but I'm not deed restrictions in their subdivisions, and so consequently they're gonna be asking me, you know, does that mean that I don't have the protections that I thought I had when I bought the property?
We can get an answer for you on that specific question. I do know that, as far as what I know right now, the law does protect deed restrictions and covenants. We read that, so we just need to get clarity on that.
Okay. And then the enforcement of that as well. It's the other issue with any deed. It doesn't even have to be affordable housing, but any deed restriction, who enforces that? I suspect you have to complain to the code enforcement office who would then pull the deed and see the restriction? I really don't know the answer to the question, so.
That's a good question. It actually recently came up. So on deed restrictions that are required by the city through the condition of approval process, we regulate those and follow up on them after approval. If they are deed restrictions put on by
Can you talk about how these density changes, both affordable housing and the multiple lots on one, multiple units on one lot, and the accessory dwelling units overlay with some of our like coastal water, like on the beachfront where we have really dense houses, can't attach new units to sewers, and there's some building restrictions there. Just is there, how do those two things go together?
Yeah, so we will continue with our resource protection permitting. So I think the coastal development dwelling unit within the structure that exists, maybe they can figure out how to do that, but we will be bound by 40% coverage in that area for CDOD. If only 20% of the lot is covered now, they could come in potentially to get building permits to add to the structure as long as they stay within the 40% coverage requirement.
And then I know down in that area, there's also some limitations on connecting new units to the sewer. That's come up recently because of some EPA money we accepted. How do accessory
Area, we've recently been told as of 2022 that no longer applies. Obviously, we would not want additional development in the floodplain area, so we would probably encourage or figure out how to encourage people to build onto structures that already exist rather than build structures in the floodplain. And if they do build structures in the floodplain, they would have to meet the freeboard that the city of Saco has, which is higher than in other development areas.
Thank you.
And they would still need to meet the setbacks for single-family residential dwellings.
Jody, can I chime in? Can I chime in?
Yes, you
Okay. Jumping back to Joe's comment about leases, and I envision these ADUs that are going to come as transitional, and whether that's someone is moving into Maine and they need a place to stay while they're looking for a house, or they've sold their house, they need a place to stay before they go to the next place. Most of the rental inquiries that I get, and most of my clients that are still living with their parents or staying somewhere temporarily with friends or family, need rentals that are less than 12 months. Sometimes it's 2 months, sometimes it's 5 months, it's all over the place. And the 12-month requirement at a lot of, buildings and apartments really kind of ties them back, and it forces us into a position where actually first-time buyers are looking at a lease period of 12 months, starting their search. Well, what if we find a house month 6, and then our landlord does try to make us liable for the rest of that lease? Then they suddenly can't afford the house.
Yeah.
So I would say if there's any sort of minimum requirement, I would say even shrinking it back to like 90 days would make sense, because there's such a wide range of need out there for the length of rentals.
Practically at that, though, I mean, yeah, maybe you have a student, or maybe you have somebody who's a seasonal worker or something, and they live 9 months out of the year, but then they go back to visit their folks in Kentucky for the summer, and then you can rent it out for 3 months, and it's not the same thing as an Airbnb. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have no problem with that, though. I mean, I understand people's concerns about this influx of Airbnb and the inability to effectively, or the inability to, since we're not getting this huge influx of Airbnb yet, though, I don't see it as a huge problem, although to Councilor Johnson's point, I do see some regulation as practical, because we don't want to lose any potential living spaces to people that are just going to, use it as a vacation home. But no, I appreciate that point, though, and I think that's a prudent one, because I would, lower the lowest possible term on the rent, the better, though. I mean, I've lived in my apartment for years, so it's month, though. So I mean, not everyone's me, though. So what are you going to do, right?
Yeah.
If I can interject here as well. So when the city redid certain sections of the ordinance, one thing in place. So one of the provisions put into our newer accessory dwelling unit, section 201, already says that no ADU may be rented on less than a monthly basis. So I think we're already covered with short-term rentals and ADUs. And then it goes on to say short-term rentals of ADUs of less than 1 month in duration are prohibited. So I think that clause covers us as far as the concerns I'm hearing around the table. It does not mean that we should not review our short-term rental ordinance holistically for the city, but a lot of the ADU provisions of the law are already allowed throughout the city. So I think you find that perhaps your zone in your ward is not affected as much as you may think it is.
ADU in these areas, those units, there's nothing that prevents those units today in any zone from being rented as a short term, and that's what's occurring. And that's my larger concern is, we're adding additional units, whether they're ADUs or just regular units, and they are being rented in a way that I think conflicts with the intent of the law. So I still think that we need to take a look at how to prevent that. We currently have something on the books for the coastal area, but it only applies down there, and I think that we should have something, we should pretty much zone where we want short-term rentals and have them where they're, where we don't desire them would be what I would suggest. Thank you.
Well, and permitting and licensing of short-term rentals could pay for its own enforcement, and that would become the benefit over the long term.
On the Airbnbs, I just want to add also, in talking to code enforcement, I mean, there's kind of two camps here with them. There's the renting of the entire unit or house. Then there's also about half of them we have where they're just a guest in someone's house. They're in a bedroom, or they're literally a guest in the same unit as the occupant. So I think there's kind of two different models out there, and I guess, a registration or, process would have to be different based on what exactly they're doing, whether it's they're renting an entire unit or they're really having someone as a guest in their home.
So this brings up the question is like how progressive, how proactive does Saco want to be? When I look at other cities, when they bring in affordable housing, they always put limitations on the development. For example, if you build it, can control the outcomes within reason. If we were to provide a tax credit for affordable housing that would go to long-term rentals, housing, to help add to our capacity, and thus hopefully reducing the cost of rent, if we offered to be a long-term rental for 5 years, it's arbitrary right now in that amount of time. Is that an approach we want to do in which we encourage developers, and again, single-family individuals who want to create an ADU, and put some rules attached to it? Give them a credit. If they provide the housing the way that the city of Saco and our housing committees, the staff one, the council-related housing committee, the long-term apartments, ADUs, that then would give us the, again, put in a penalty if you break it. I know a lot of the housing in Portland, it's $100-something thousand. You get fined if you don't agree. I wouldn't say that that's appropriate for our case, but a discussion, is it worth looking and things like that? Is that worth something that Saco is willing to consider, is that we help chip in the cost to affordable housing in Saco?
I think that might be one of the items to look at as far as the housing committee Brian is putting together. I think it's already on the list. I think it's a good point.
But I think that would be in some regions, not others. It wouldn't have to be for affordable housing. It could be for affordable housing in certain districts or in certain zones, which could help guide that type of development as well as encouraging it, which I think would make it a very powerful and useful tool.
Emily, is this on? Emily, I don't want to, it feels like we're kind of dwelling in it. Once we're over beyond an accessory dwelling unit, we're into multifamily. And that where this LD 2003 is kind of addressing both, it's the affordable multifamily component. That's a little bit separate, right? I mean,
Somewhat.
They're somewhat separate, and it's meaning we can't, out in North Saco, we can't have multiple we can't have 4 ADUs on one property or anything like that. That's not what we're saying here.
So in growth areas, the new law would allow you to have up to 4 dwelling units in areas that are.
Right.
So you'd have to prove that you have wastewater capacity and well capacity to handle those new units.
Yeah, that's the one exception, so we might want to look at that differently now. But then, I think to Counselor Berman's point and to Counselor Archer's point, some other towns require, if you build over 10, or 10 dwelling units, you must have 10, 15, 25% of them being affordable. Is that something we want to do? And then additionally, where we must, or the dimensional standards, but does it prohibit us to require more green space or solar or higher energy efficient buildings, or not to, I guess just for discussion, be a little bit opposite of Councilor Archer, to either provide more direction? Are we trying to encourage the affordable housing, and to what capacity, or in what zones, or do we want to just allow it and see what happens, or?
Well, that's the great thing with
That's-
credits, is you can design how credit is given. So you could again, this is all for discussion purposes at the moment, but yeah, you could put other parameters on it.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm alluding to. It seems to me there's an opportunity to, have this and create additional benefits.
Smaller. And if it's out in my ward, in Ward 3, though, there's nothing really else around, though, you could make things slightly higher, though, because you're going to preserve more green space out there. That's not like building a 4 or 5-story thing in somebody's, because there literally is no neighborhood out there. It is Route 1, and anything that's off Route 1, though. So any potential zoning prohibitions that pre-exist would have to be looked at the planning board level for the simple, also being in compliance with the law that'd have to be done away with, though. But again, with our zoning, in the practical places where it makes sense, though. So if we're trying to maximize our potential, we're not doing it in areas that don't make any sense, though. We're essentially trying to build up the parts of the city that have been underutilized and that could be, have the most benefit, though, to your point, though. Like I said, we would have to just go through the books and see, what part. Do it down on the coast because we have coastal regulations. We can't do it here because we have covenants. And then it's just going to become this round-robin thing, though. And at the end of the day, we're still going to have to do something. And if it ends up in the worst possible way, then that.
And it's the direction. That's always what it is, especially from a developer. It's always direction. Free-for-all doesn't help anybody. And to Councilor McPhail's point about the historic, component, if this falls in the historic zone, if you add a second-story addition to a historic structure or a structure within the historic zone, can we implement a design element that sets that work, 10 feet back from the.
So I think those are.
I'm just saying there's a lot more.
Those are the exact right questions to be asking. And just some of the ways I'm thinking about it is this bill, as I understand it, there's 2 different things that we want to consider. One is it encourages affordable housing growth, and I'm all for that. I think that's really important, and so I want Saco to be in, and I want it to be progressive to address Councilor Archer's point. But the other thing I think it does is it prohibits some things, right? For example, you were talking about 1 ADU, but actually I think it allows up to 2 ADUs in any existing house, and up to 4 units, even in a single-family lot right now that's unbuilt. It prohibits us from stopping that. And so the question is, how do we manage some of those prohibitions also? And that's where I thought Councilor Archer's point was maybe attractive, in that although we can't prohibit that, we can encourage it in certain places where it's desirable. And that's another area of guidance that I think Council and the Planning Board would really be encouraged to provide some guidance. So, for example, that would fundamentally change the character of some neighborhoods if you suddenly tripled the, because we can't prohibit it, but we do want to guide it. How do we encourage it? And so I think that's where some of those credits and ideas might come in also. So yes, we want affordable housing, but we don't want a right to kind of guide some of that development necessarily taken away. And so by using some of your tools and some of planning's tools and some of council's tools, can we provide some guidance to developers where we want it, right? You can do it anywhere, but we're going to give you a 20% tax credit if you do it here. You can do it anywhere, but if you do it in already sewered land, in places that we've targeted for high growth, in places where we think the road capacity can do it, and you make and. We want to mitigate the impacts of taking that authority away from us while also encouraging that affordable housing growth.
Yeah, I agree. Those are good points. And then I think what we don't want to do is have every project affordable. That's what it seems like. A lot of the questions, sure, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I think that some of the impacts of this ordinance are to encourage affordable housing, which is maybe why some of the conversation is centered around that.
Correct. I think one of the examples is Portland, for example. It's at 10. I do a lot of them. And a lot of developers build 10. And if they are trying not to do affordable, Portland's trying to push affordable. And then when developers do affordable, they're building. I think that's what, I guess, what we're seeing. Excuse me, what we're seeing. But I couldn't agree more with your thoughts.
But again, providing these credits to the individual, the landowner, not talking to this level at scale, because that's how they're able to offset that cost, is that they're building at scale. But if you're talking 10 owners throughout 10 different properties or spread out among the city, that throughout the city, scattered it all around, I don't even know if we'd recognize it, to be honest. But we were talking about affordable, and one of the things I do not like about ordinance, I'm a big fan of how HUD works and how they say it's always in a percentage of the AMI, because the AMI changes. And when you do a percentage, it should be definitely defined to something 30%, 40%. We can figure out, could be 50, 60, I'm just bringing up a point here, but connect it to the AMI, because then that allows for the market to grow and shrink, and that number can change. You don't have to keep on making ordinances over ordinances to
Need income for the area.
yeah, okay, thank
To answer your question, rulemaking is defining how much a majority means. So you could have affordable housing projects that have 51% affordable units. So right now, the language in rulemaking is just a majority of units, more than half.
The thing, credit to the single individual, 100% of the units would have to be affordable, because it's one unit. So to make sure that it's well-defined before a credit is given.
I think there's a lot to think about here, and I appreciate all the feedback. Happy to answer any more questions. There's going to be more questions than answers forward with analyzing what ordinance amendments are needed as we go forward.
And I might encourage city administrator to populate our workshop agenda as you get enough information that you're worthy to come back, so we can kind of keep this on track. I think we need to be very sensitive to time issues here. So.
Okay, any other additional questions? Comments? Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate the update.
Listen, Matt, thanks for giving up your evening. We appreciate that.
Okay, next up on the workshop, we've got council goal setting exercise.